It's not that he doesn't have an opinion. It's just the words aren't strong enough. There's a vagueness. There's a veil because of time, because of where we are and our construct of time, which is a whole nother ball of wax when, my goodness, when you start thinking about time. And he talks about that.
Yeah.
He mentions Anados from Phantastes when he says you cannot in your present state understand eternity. When Anados looked through the door of the timeless, he brought no message back. I mean, that kind of clues you in that it's like you're not going to get necessarily a definitive answer about hell or the way out of hell. Let's put it that way. But there actually is a way out of hell, and that is obedience to God, turning, letting go of self, which is what the stories are about. The George MacDonald character says, "You are not brought here to study curiosities," which I thought was kind of fun of him to say that. And he says, "What concerns you is the nature of choice itself."
'Twas the week before Christmas, and all through the podcast, lots of creatures were stirring. For how could we be still? How could we be silent? We're about to take the plunge. Welcome to The Plunge with Derek Holzer. Derek here. You're jumping into episode 5 on our 9-part series in C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce. Joining me is a good friend, a dear woman, Karen Scheffler, and she is originally from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Half a lifetime ago, according to her, she moved to Vermont, where she and her husband raised 2 sons. She's been a teacher, a wildflower, an artist, and a business owner. She claims to be the person who stands at the back of the room taking it all in. She further claims that she's an insignificant human, intensely interested in becoming that shining light about which she's heard rumors. Less and less terrified about what it means, mainly because of all the stars she's been meeting along the way. Well, as you listen into this episode, I think you'll discover, as I have, that Karen is not an insignificant human, for in fact there are no insignificant humans, but Karen least of all. She may stand at the back of the room and take it all in, but as she does, her own soul comes to light, and she radiates truth, goodness, and beauty to everyone who encounters her. I hope you find her as refreshing and delightful as I do. So join us on episode 5, The Great and Terrible Afterlife, our conversation on the Great Divorce. I'm grateful to Karen for being willing to take the plunge. Well, I'm so excited to have my friend Karen here with us to discuss C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce. And I got the privilege of meeting Karen about a year ago at an event in Atlanta, organization called Open Table Conference School of Theology. A lot of different names, but a fun group of people getting together to ponder our existence, our relationships with God and one another, and just had such a joy getting to know Karen and invited her to come and share with us on this series. So Karen, welcome.
Hi, thank you.
So glad to have you. Can you tell us a little bit about where you're at in the world and what life is like for you these days?
Sure. I live in northern Vermont. I'm about 10 miles from the Canadian border at my house. I own a coffee bar and an art studio that's fresh, new on the horizon for me. Doing something that I had done for years, but returning to making stained glass windows. Besides the coffee bar, which is a joy to run and work with people and share conversation and coffee, I also have this space where I can just retreat and do art. So that's what's going on in my side of the world, and a little snow as well.
Oh my goodness. Well, I was in northern Maine in Canada last month, so not far from you. And what's fascinating is I forgot about your stained glass art.
Mm.
And on my flight, I watched a movie that you might have seen called Holy Frit. So you'll have to check it out. I didn't know what
Well,
frit was,
yeah,
which of course you do as a stained glass artist.
yeah.
It's the story and documentary of the artist and the group that created the world's largest stained glass window at a massive church in, I believe it's in Missouri, Kansas City.
I believe so. Yes. Yes. Wow. I'll have to watch it. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, well, it's worth watching even for those of us like me who have never dabbled with stained glass. I learned a ton about the craft, but
Mm.
also some of the new innovative techniques that they implemented to create this. I think it's 4,000 square foot pane. I mean, it's massive,
Massive.
massive.
My goodness. Yeah. Wow.
Uh,
I'm
so,
excited to go do that and watch it now.
yeah, well, we'll make a note. We won't keep you too long here today. So we'll jump into the Great Divorce.
Okay.
And part of the reason, Karen, as you've gotten to know me, one of the things I'm really passionate about is story. And I think there's a reason that Jesus mostly shared parables,
Yeah.
and stories have such a rich heritage, but also lasting effect in the human psyche and soul and spirit. And so we're doing this series on the Great Divorce. But before we get into that, I'm curious if you have encountered or have a memory in your childhood or any time of your life, really, reading a book that captivated you. And was there a story that transcended everything around you and carried you off to its world? What would that be?
Absolutely. As a young girl, I love to read, and The Secret Garden is one of the books that just really brought me into its space for a lot of reasons. The mystery of the garden, the characters in the book who are the main character Mary is selfish and spoiled and miserable. And through a series of natural events, her parents passed away. She had to go live with an uncle in Yorkshire. She lived in India prior to that. She, as just like in India, she was pretty much ignored by her uncle and his servants. Of course, it was a manor that she lived in, so there were rambling rooms and mystery all around, which that in itself is captivating. And then she hears about a garden that's been neglected, and she's kind of determined to find it. And I was really enthralled with a couple things. A bird showed her where the key was to the garden, but then she had to find the door, which was all overgrown with, ivy and living things. And she did get in, and it was almost dead. It was neglected. It was hardly any life in there, but there was life in there. And so she and two of the other characters in the book, one was ill, and her uncle's son was ill and probably more spoiled than she. And then another character, Dickon, who is just this earthy, wise little boy who, he's just, I don't know, he's just the impetus for getting things going in the garden, because he's a nature boy. He's a little farm guy, and he's close to the earth. So they end up restoring the garden, and in that restoration, it restores them, like particularly Mary and Colin. And it's just a beautiful story about beauty, love, transformation through the natural world, through digging in the earth, being with friends, sharing that. I wouldn't have identified that at all at 8, probably not even 28. But the story just is just a really beautiful story of hope, healing, and the energies of transformation. So that's why I love it.
That's beautiful. Well, I never picked it up. but I am very familiar with it, and I believe they've adapted it to a film more than once, I think, over the years.
Yeah, yep, yep.
Uh,
I really identified it. Again, I wouldn't have said this probably before the SOT that we shared in Atlanta, but when I became aware of the Sacred Heart, but I would definitely conjoin the two. The Secret Garden is almost like the Sacred Heart for me. It's that it's that important. Not necessarily just the book, but what it says. So I would definitely check it out. Read it. Don't watch the movie.
okay, of course. Well, since you brought it up, I'm curious, not to put you on the spot, so if you don't want to answer it, we can just cut it out. But tell me a little bit more about that connection, what the Sacred Heart means. What does that phrase mean to you, and how is it connected there?
Yeah, it's the Secret Garden and the Sacred Heart to me are the places where God reaches. You know,
Mm,
in say in the Secret Garden, it's where the transformation took place. In the Sacred Heart of Christ, it's where the transformation takes place. There is no other way other than being there in God, you know. And so that's why. Yeah.
that's so poetic, and as you describe, there's seems to me the theme in so much of literature that lasts of returning to a garden, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Hmm. Well, speaking of imagery and and story,
Yeah.
the book that we're discussing today, The Great Divorce, is laden with it, and a fun tale, an interesting take, and I'm curious about when you might have first read it.
Probably at least 25 years ago, if not more. It was in my Love Lewis days when I was just enthralled with everything, you know, that he wrote. And I wanted to read everything that he wrote, and I wanted to read everything that he read. Of course, I haven't achieved that, but he did definitely, through reading him, encourage me to want to read the people that he read. So, yeah, it was
Hmm.
definitely a long time ago. Of course, George MacDonald is one of the people who he read, and I did eventually read a lot of George, which is also probably something we want to talk about. But then
Of
I read
course.
it again, and because you like spurred me on to read it again, and I have a somewhat different view of it now. Yeah.
Well, good. I look forward to digging into that. Was your initial read, was your impression a positive one, would you say?
It scared me to death. Yeah. In some ways, it still does. It's a horror story for sure.
Yeah, it is quite frightening, isn't it?
Yep.
Okay, well, let's segue from that. Then I have a question.
Okay.
Since it is so horrifying, is there a scene in that book that particularly filled you with sorrow or apprehension or dread? And if so, which one?
Yeah, actually, I have one. All of them, pretty much. Well, not all of them, but one in particular, I wanted to pick out and talk about the woman who believed she was hiding when she
Hmm.
came up the ghost. She wants to be alone. She wants no help. She's terrified of being seen through. She questions why we were ever born. What for? She ignores the answer for happiness, which she's given by the bright spirit.
Hmm.
She ignores that completely. She almost steps out, but then she pivots. The spirit implores her to fix her mind on something other than herself. But man, flat cold, no, no. Um, the I feel like it's sorrowful because she's so trapped by how she looks to others. Better said by the spirit that she can fixate on nothing but herself, never thinking whatever her shame to accept it, allow it to nourish her, and it would make all the difference in her perception. You know, I agonized with the Lewis character that she would drink the shame, drink the cup. Because in that scene, he's waiting for her to do it. He's like, she's going to do it. And then she doesn't.
I'm curious about that. I was trying to find it in my copy of the book. Do you have the chapter?
Yeah, it's actually page 60.
Because I remember it.
Yeah.
And the quote is, "Shame is like that. If you will accept it, if you will drink the cup to the bottom, you will find it very nourishing. But try to do anything else with it, and it scalds." And so I'm really glad you brought this one up, not the least of which because of the whole concern and obsession with what other people think, right? That many of us are plagued by. But I, in particular, reacted to drinking the cup of shame.
Yeah.
Because that word means some things that maybe are negative and things that I don't associate with God. So I'm curious about what you do with that.
Yeah, I really struggled with that because just like her, I mean, in so many of these stories of the ghosts, we can see ourselves, at least I can. And so I, like you, have similar ideas of what the cool thing is, and I do have to look at my notes. Okay, so I have a note about shame in the sermons that was so apropos. It was about, I'm going to see if I can find it for us because I think it's really important because it's, and here's this crazy thing I love about this book. It's, while I say it's a horror story, it's also like you feel the bright people, they're like saying, look, if you just turn, if you just look at yourself, you'll find it's all just, not that they're laughing, but there's a mirth about what the bright spirits are trying to give to the ghost. And like, to me, that's like, oh man, I want to be there. I want to be at that point where I can, drink my shame, drink what I've done that I'm not proud of, that I know isn't of love's kind, that it's things I've done, and to know that sure, I guess in Christ it's healed. The shame is healed.
Uh-huh.
We're all kind of in the same boat. We do stuff that we shouldn't do, and we think, and we don't do stuff. So yeah.
So true. Well, and I appreciate that perspective because I connecting those dots is very helpful for me. I was reflecting recently on a quote from Chesterton about how moderate strength reveals itself in violence, but supreme strength reveals itself in levity. And the lightness of the bright spirits is so compelling, as you say, and yet it's like it's so hard to let go.
Absolutely. Yeah, that letting go. It's like that's what all the stories are about, except for, well, all the stories are about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why it's a horror story.
Right.
Because you're looking at yourself when you.
Yeah. Staring at that mirror for too long, it starts to hurt.
I think I might have found if I could just share the part in the unspoken sermons that talks about shame.
Of course.
Yeah. Okay.
Course.
So
and before you do, Karen, just for people who are unfamiliar, Unspoken Sermons is a collection of messages from George MacDonald that were basically sermons he never got to preach. So
yeah. Or he did in other ways, but this is, so for to be shamed is a holy and blessed thing. Shame is a thing to shame only those who want to appear, not those who want to be. In the name of God, let us henceforth have nothing to be ashamed of and be ready to meet any shame on its way to meet us. For to be humbly ashamed is to be plunged into the cleansing bath of truth. Wow. That cleansing bath of truth. It's awesome. At least I can say that now, right here.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Until bath time comes around again.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
On the flip side, as we talked about the tough stuff, is there a scene in The Great Divorce that fills you with hope?
Yeah. So the same scene, actually. And it was really kind of, I love this because I've never really paid attention to unicorns. But in this same scene, the unicorns come, they stampede, they come to her. Okay, so I learned that, first of all, the unicorn is the national animal of Scotland, by the way. The unicorn is also part of Celtic mythology, which I didn't know. It symbolizes purity and innocence and power, goodness, gentleness, feminine energy, enchantment, and miracles.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, in Christianity, they are a Christ figure of his purity, strength, and the symbol of hope, the transformative power of love and sacrifice. So just that this stampede of unicorns comes to this woman is like, wow, that is so cool. To me, it's like super, super hopeful. A way to talk about Christ coming to this woman without saying it.
Mm-hmm.
The funny thing is that Lewis in the story, the character Lewis, loses his nerve and doesn't look to see what happens.
Yeah.
No judgment.
Well, I'm so glad you brought it up. So in my copy that I've got of the book here, in that paragraph where the spirit blows a horn and the earth shakes and these unicorns show up, I just wrote, "What?"
Yeah.
With a question mark. Thank you for all of the context for unicorn as a symbol. I should have explored that on my own, but that's very helpful.
Well, yeah, that was part of the fun of reading the book again. Yeah.
I wonder why he did not look back.
Well, that's a curious thing because, mostly in the book up to that point I think that's right before, I believe that's right before he meets George MacDonald. I think so.
That's correct. Yeah, it's the scene with the unicorns is the end of chapter 8, and then chapter 9 opens with George's appearance.
So, I imagine that. I mean, just imagining it. That he wouldn't have the strength. Well, it says he lost his nerve. Like I get that. Like you want to know, but you don't want to know because you're afraid of the answer. Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense.
I mean, I think at the time that I read this 25 years ago, I was also afraid of the answer because for so much, I mean, I grew up in a home that was very open. I mean, my parents were both believers in God. There wasn't a big focus on hell and everything until I got older. I guess when there was all that nonsense about, the late great planet Earth and what is it, the rapture and all that kind of stuff. Like that was always on the fringe, but it was on the fringe, but there was, because I always have been thinking about God all my life, it was there. So of course I didn't want to know the answer necessarily because it really did frighten me in this book. It's like, what if I'm wrong? What if God is something I don't really want him to be,
Yeah. Well, and to borrow from the books that followed after the late great planet Earth, what if I'm left behind?
Oh my gosh, yeah. Oh,
right.
That's this book was terror, but that was a terror of a different kind, not a good kind at all. Yeah.
No
way.
Not the least of which was its prose, but anyway.
Yeah, right. I didn't actually read that series, but my sister was
Well,
into it. But anyway,
yeah, I got through about 6 chapters of the first book, and that was about it for me.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. So no judgment there on Lewis.
yeah,
But then he sees George. You know, he comes upon George. George comes to him.
yeah, he
Yeah,
does. So I know, like me, George has come to you at points in your life, and at least for me, it was through Lewis, and perhaps for you that you
same.
discovered him. Yeah. So before we jump into George's appearance in the book, do you have anything you'd like to talk about with respect to George's appearance in your own life?
In my life
Yeah,
or in the book?
in your life, and if not, we can move on to the book.
Okay. So the first book I read was Fantastes. I
Uh-huh.
never know if I say that right.
That's
Fantasy.
how I've heard it pronounced.
Yeah.
Yeah, Fantastes.
And I read it because Lewis read it, and because it changed him. You know, it began its transformation for him. And honestly, I read it and I was like, wow, this is really like beyond me. I'm here. I'm not understanding it completely. Wow, is he ever wordy? Yeah, he's right. He's a late Victorian writer, Victorian. So that was my first encounter, and then I read the easier ones, like The Back of the North Wind, Princess and Curdie, and Sir Gibby, and all those beautiful stories. And at the time, I had children, so I read them to them, and that's my first introduction to George.
Oh, wonderful. Um,
And I love At the Back of the North Wind. That's my all-time favorite of his. I just love it.
yeah, Diamond. So fun.
Yeah.
I I encountered the fiction as well in my younger years, and for me, again, like you, the style of writing was cumbersome, and so it was it was again Jess Letterman, who is a part of this series, his edition of the unspoken sermons that just meant everything to me and
Yeah.
continues to. So yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about George in the book.
Okay.
He appears in chapter 9, and he serves as Lewis's guide through the rest of the story. And I love this description. Lewis describes MacDonald as an enthroned and shining God whose ageless spirit weighed upon mine like a burden of solid gold. And yet, at the very same moment, here was an old, weather-beaten man, one who might have been a shepherd, such a man as tourists think simple because he is honest, and neighbors think deep for the same reason. What do you think of that description?
I love that too. I just love that. I was so taken into that description. And I feel Lewis's layers in those sentences of the love he has for him, whether I'm just thinking it's there or not. I feel it. Like he he doesn't look any of the solid people in the face, but he looks George in the face, and he knows him and he trusts him. He tells you that. I thought when I was reading that, I was like, wow, this is because I'm reading Julian of Norwich at the same time, and I was like, oh, this is like the double vision. Like, I think she talked about it once in her long text. I couldn't find it. I really wanted to find it to share it with us, but it reminded me so much of the double vision that you can see both the divinity and the humanity in a person when we're,
Hmm.
or maybe now we can see it too.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
I'm just curious if you have any insight to Julian of Norwich, and what compelled you to be reading her.
Julian, boy, she's well, there again, we have friends, people we know that talk about things, and they're like, they spur us on to read other people. I actually, for Julian, I had heard about it through like Chris Green and, all our mutual friends, Ken Tanner, all of them. And I've wanted to read her through a customer I have who's really a friend. He's a teacher of English literature at one of the high schools here in Vermont. And he comes in the mornings, has coffee, comes in on the weekends, has coffee, and we chat. And one day I took care of his dog and he was away, and on his bookshelf was Julian of Norwich. And I just was drawn to it. I asked him if I could borrow it. And a year later, he said, yeah, sure, here. We finally got together again to do it, or I asked him. So, boy, it's, my goodness, I read her every day.
Wow. And what would you say is stirring you when you read her, and what is, for those who are unacquainted, how would you describe it?
Okay, so she's a mystic, and she was in a, I don't know what you call it. She was part of a church. She was, I'm forgetting the word that they used. Not locked up, but she was sheltered,
like in a convent, or
and had visions of Christ coming to her and talking with her about how things are. One of the things that connects Julian with George MacDonald, I feel, is that all through her showings, she says things, but she also acknowledges that, words are inadequate. Just like in The Great Divorce, George is always telling Lewis, you think of time this way, you say it this way, but, because the words aren't strong enough, or the vision isn't strong enough for us. We can only take a little bit at a time, so that's one of the things. I mean, I have some struggles with Julian, of course, but I do love to read her because she really, really, it hits home that, or she stresses that it really will all be well. I mean, we don't see, we see so dimly, but God is love. Have faith in him is trusting him. There is no other thing to do but trust him. That's your faith. That's Christ. It's, faith, trust. And boy, that can be hard to do in a daily basis. So that's why I read her.
That's so encouraging. Is there a particular collection that you're reading now?
No.
Okay.
You mean what, translation or?
Yeah, or for people who this is the first time they've heard of her, is it just sort of short essays? What is it like?
So the book that I have it's a translation of her showings, which are the visions, and then that's a short text. And then they do the long text where later on in her life, she thought about what the visions again and explained them more. So it's the short text and the long text in the same book.
Wow.
Yeah, it's intense. I mean, I would suggest to anybody, it's hard to say other than she had these visions of seeing Christ on the cross, and and all the things. There are no words. I have no words right now. You just have to read it.
Okay. Well, and it sounds like, again, coming back to this theme of letting go being the pivotal thing that we are faced with to do each day of our life, each hour, perhaps.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And sometimes, like, even after reading The Great Divorce, it's really hit home to me how much we do have to pay attention. Like Simone Weil, we have to pay attention. Like, we can get so distracted, and yet for it to be light, not necessarily so heavy, but there's that, as they say, that tension of joy and seriousness. The serious
Yeah,
joy is the serious business of heaven, right?
that's right.
Yeah.
That's from Mr. Lewis, I believe.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for letting us know a little bit about Julian of Norwich.
Thank you for letting me go on and on about her in a very, fractured way. It's almost like breaking glass. I'll put it together at some point, maybe.
Right. Well, and how cool with that metaphor, because it ends up being a mosaic of color, right? That ends up being the image that takes our breath away.
Yeah. Right.
Huh.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I feel like just sitting for a second.
I hear that. I'm right there with you.
Yeah. Thank you for doing this, by the way. Really.
Derek, thank you. I was really nervous and scared and, wanted to hide. So thank you.
Well, I was so moved by your own journey and your electricity, quite frankly. I mean, there's a life in your eyes and in our conversation that I missed. And so thank you.
Thank you. Oh
My question, I was
Yeah.
looking here in chapter 9. I'm curious about this whole dynamic with George, of course, and in particular Lewis creating MacDonald as a character, and then, obviously Lewis is saying what he thinks George would say. And in chapter 9, Lewis asks MacDonald, is judgment not final? Is there really a way out of hell into heaven? And I'm curious, I was looking actually to see what page that was on, because I wanted to be specific with the question or the answer that MacDonald is given. Do you happen to have it?
Yeah. Let's see. So chapter 9, right? Where
Right.
he says, is judgment not final? Is there really a way out of hell into heaven? And then of course, George says, well, it depends on how you're using those words. And which is really not unlike George. Like,
Right.
it's even like what working through his unspoken sermons. I mean, he's definitely, it's not that he doesn't have an opinion. It's just the words aren't strong enough. The words are, yeah, it's hard. You have to, it's almost, there's a vagueness, there's a veil, because we cannot, because of time, because of where we are in our construct of time, which is a whole nother ball of wax when, my goodness, when you start thinking about time. And he talks about that in that he mentions Anados from Phantastes when he says you cannot in your present state understand eternity. When Anados looked through the door of the timeless, he brought no message back. I mean, that kind of clues you in that it's like you're not going to get necessarily a definitive answer about hell or the way
Yeah.
out of hell. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Very interesting.
But I think also here is there's a lot, there's so much in this little chapter here that we could talk about, I guess. But there actually is a way out of hell, and that is obedience to God, turning, letting go of self, which is what the stories are about. So on page 69,
Yeah.
he's talking about purgatory and his Catholic friends and his Protestant friends, and the George MacDonald character kind of says, we can't understand that. And he says, you're not brought here to study curiosities, which I thought was kind of fun of him to say that. And he says, what concerns you is the nature of choice itself. which is really, it's what he's seeing with all the ghosts, their choice and the nature of choice. So I think the Lewis character is tussling with the nature of choice because he says so. In the beginning of the book, in the introduction, he talks about how the book is really about dispelling or speaking to the idea that heaven and hell are somehow a marriage. I never read Milton, so I can't. And he references Blake in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. I haven't read. I think I tried to read that one time, but I couldn't.
Yeah.
But that's what the book. He's trying to speak to that idea that there cannot be hell and heaven. It's like George MacDonald is speaking about the line between the two. Evil can't be turned into good over time. It can't be turned into good with development or refinement. It can be undone. The spirit can be broken, but there's no allowing the hell to veto heaven.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then later on, like, I think in the same, let me see where, they start talking about states of mind.
Right. The bottom of page 70. It's really interesting because it is reflected in the way that Lewis describes the terrain of this place, in that heaven, he says, or George's character says, heaven is not a state of mind, which he had just said hell might be. Heaven is reality itself. And all that is fully real is heavenly. The reason I brought it up is because I think of MacDonald's portrayal of God's love as the consuming fire. And going back to your point about this notion of the marriage of heaven and hell, could it not be, using the way that MacDonald speaks of it, merely one's perception? They could actually be in heaven and think they're in hell. And I think that's hinted at anyway. Lots of fun speculation.
Yeah, because he says about, those who, they think they've been in hell all the whole time, and those who see differently and think they've been in heaven the whole time. Yeah It's that time thing. It's that what is it? I mean, I guess I hold on to the fact that where God is where reality is. There is no other reality, and I would say that he's just trying to get us to understand or to become awake to the fact that we have to reject evil. There's no compromise. We do have to reject the evil in ourselves, and that's a journey. So with Lewis, the conflation of self-choice and hell is key. So they're both, or they're one thing. Like the mind as a dungeon shut up in itself. The door's locked. Lewis's visions of the door's locked from the inside. As time goes on, I go to the place, well, the doors might be locked from the inside, but Christ can get in anyway.
Right.
And I think even MacDonald says that later on, if I'm not mistaken. He says that. Back almost towards the end. Yeah. On page 124, Lewis asked him, can no one ever reach them? And then MacDonald says, only the greatest of all can make himself small enough to enter hell. For the higher a thing is, the lower it can descend. And he goes on, and will he ever do so again? And he goes on to say he's done it. And then they start talking about the universalist thing, and there's the vague language again.
Right. Well, do you want to touch on that before my next question?
On the universalism?
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you?
Okay. I'm always wide open to discuss anything, but
Well, I mean, as far as the thing about the book that I think is really too bad is that while it's a great book, well, no, let me frame that a little differently. Lewis is always telling us to go further in and further up. Like that's what he does. And I can't help but think that in The Great Divorce, he's also telling us the same thing. Don't
Mm-hmm.
just sit here and think that this is how it is. I mean, in the beginning, he even says, and in the end, he says, this is a dream. Don't, he says, the McDonald character says, be sure. I love the line where he says, be sure you don't let any fool think that this is anything but a dream.
Uh-huh.
And so we know that George and Lewis have said George believes that all will be well, using Julian's language, because he believes everyone will repent.
Right, right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I'll go there with him with that.
yeah, yeah. Well, I've said it many times, but the piece of the puzzle for me that resonates very deeply is the notion of the impossibility of reconciliation after we cease to live on this earth. That concept was my reality for many, many years. And the reason that I dismissed it, was if that is the case, if my dying ends my opportunity to be reconciled to God forever, then Jesus didn't defeat death, because my death is still the deciding factor in this relationship.
Yeah.
And so that's an impossibility. If otherwise, the whole thing is pointless.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah. 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 Right on. Amen to that.
Amen. Well, I'll jump to my next question.
Okay.
In chapter 11, Lewis's portrayal of MacDonald tells him that there is but one good, that is God. Everything else is good when it looks to him and bad when it turns from him. And the higher and mightier it is in the natural order, the more demoniac it will be if it rebels. I personally struggle with it. That's why I'm asking you what you think about it and whether or not you agree.
So probably that's one of the inaccurate statements, I think, that although, I'm open to, a greater mind to share about that, because one of the things that comes to mind is Lewis's portrayal of, you never know who you're meeting, someone who is turning into a god or turning into a demon. And because that kind of sort of solidifies the idea that, oh, it's one or the other you're going to be. And I don't like that.
Yeah.
I don't think that's truth, Maybe it's not the whole truth,
There you go.
because certainly, yeah, there again, it's not the whole truth.
Where in your estimation would it be lacking?
Well, there's always hope for turning around, for pivoting and coming to. And I think in the book there is always that compelling to do so. George is definitely one who talks about, in the unspoken sermons, he talks about, whether it takes, it may take a long time. It could be eons. And that's why, like in reading the book, when one of the things that I think about is okay, so the ghosts get back on the bus and they go back down to hell, quote unquote, and they get farther and farther away. And it's harder and harder, but there's a crack in the ground, and it's just a little crack. And the one, she goes down and down and down to try to get, I think it's the dwarf, I'm not sure,
Yeah.
And George says, see that crack? That's the hell you're talking about. It's down there. But then George MacDonald in the sermons, he talks about well, even in the smallest crack in earth, something can sprout, life can come.
Yes.
Right. And then I go back to the secret garden and I'm like, holy smokes, it's like, yeah, in that neglected garden, there was a hint of life, so there, yeah.
Yeah. A mighty tree sprouting from a scrap of dirt in the cleft of a rock, right? I mean,
Yeah, we've seen it in on earth happen.
yes, all the time.
What a beauty that is.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
And so much hope, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, well, I want to be mindful of our time. I have two questions that are mirrors of each other. So one in which your thoughts on an interaction between Lewis and MacDonald in which you think Lewis's portrayal was maybe off the mark, and then one in which you think Lewis's portrayal was spot on with respect to his way he characterizes George MacDonald.
Yeah. So what I thought is that I would say that the only way Lewis has portrayed George inaccurately is because the story is moving us to see something that MacDonald certainly held as true, that there can be no heaven with a little bit of hell in it. In the book, there isn't the urging of tremendous hope that George had, even though it was a long time. We just talked about that. Will turn and repent. Like there's some of that in The Great Divorce, but not enough, I think. So it's risky business. This book really is risky business. But then again, God is risky business because, there's always like people could read the book and say, oof, ugh, I don't, oh gosh, I don't.
Yeah, a lot of people still doing things that don't help them.
Yeah, right. And so that's my only thought, because if you read George, his books, they're so wholesome. And while there is really tough situations going on, there's always that hope in him, even with the tough things, like in the unspoken sermons. There's some hard things to digest in the unspoken sermons. And if you stick with it, it does change you, but there's still hard things, but there's still that overarching hope, like real hope, which I didn't really find in The Great Divorce.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's where I think that's the inaccuracy that comes in my estimation. Otherwise, I think the book is very accurate in the portrayal of him. Much of what he says, how he portrays him is spot on in so many ways. Most notable would be a man can be made good. A man cannot be made good without his own willed share. We have to give our will over. We have to let go. We have to, all the stories are about whether it's withholding or coming to letting go, or as in the case of Sarah Smith, that's on page 107, one of the great ones. She comes to the two phantoms, the dwarf and the tragedy, the guy.
Yes.
Oh gosh, I can't say it. All of the things that let me go there for a second, because
Please do.
162. Okay, so for example, I think it's in the unspoken sermons in like the last farthing.
Yeah.
The whole thing on, I could read the whole thing, but I'm not going to do that because that would be really long. It's on May 23rd if you want to read it. But that a man can be made good without his own willed share in the making, that a man is saved by having his sins hidden under a robe of imputed righteousness, that system is the system of the devil and not of God. I mean, he does portray him throughout the whole thing as, we participate in this. God's not going to just make us do. He's going to be patient and encourage us and use all kinds of things to encourage us to turn. And I think that's a really good portrayal. The book does a great job because MacDonald is key. That's key for him. Obeying.
Yes.
And trusting.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. What fun. It's one of my joys in life is to discuss the whole point of everything.
Yeah.
Spurred on by interesting books and in conversation, dialogue with good friends. So this is a blast for me, and I would love for you to share any final thoughts you have about the Great Divorce, as well as the relationship between MacDonald and Lewis, and anything else that you would like to talk about.
Well, we talked about it a little earlier about it is, I think Chris Green said to me one time, it is a really sad story. But, one of the things that I did love about it was just putting myself in the place of being, who I am, knowing that I am not fully who I really am. And having a bright person, a bright God, a bright angel, whatever, come to me and show me what it is that I need to let go of, and to find joy in that.
Right.
I'm there. I love that. That's the one positive piece that I want to take away from this horror story. Yeah. And I mentioned before about my Love Lewis days. I love Lewis. I do. And the people that there are so many people around us to nourish and tell their stories and uplift and uphold us, because it can get pretty hard sometimes to keep on the path. So I really appreciate what you're doing. It's important. It really is.
Thank you.
Story is art, and we are God's art, and it's who we are is who we need to be.
Beautiful.
Cheers to that unmasking.
Cheers to that. And I think about the stained glass work that you do, and it's when the light fully shines through us that the true beauty is revealed.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Yep.
Very cool. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Derek. And much love to Leah.
Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word masquerade, 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 a noun which means a false show or pretense, the wearing of a disguise. Also, masquerade ball is an event in which everyone comes with a mask, hiding their real selves. With the success of the play and film Wicked, and all the derivative works of The Wizard of Oz, we were contacted by the word masquerade because it's something that was done as a key feature of that story by Frank Baum, thank you, Frank, but also continues to be perpetuated throughout culture as people hide and disguise themselves from their true meaning and true beauty, fearful of what they might encounter in the world or desirous of making a good impression that's really not sincere. Masquerade wanted to sponsor this episode as well because Karen Scheffler doesn't wear a masquerade. She's authentic through and through. So we're grateful to Karen for appearing, and we're grateful to the word masquerade for sponsoring today's episode. comes from the late 16th century, from the French, meaning mask, from the Italian as well. The French word is mascherade, and the Italian is mascheretta. Don't know if I really pronounced those right, just reading it, you know. I'm not multilingual, sadly. But masquerade, you're multilingual. That word translates and resonates in every culture and civilization. So thank you, Masquerade, for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge. And may I encourage you, this week and this new year coming up, take off the mask. Be yourselves. Peace.